Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our webinar this evening. Again, my name is Dr. Felice Knight. I am the Director of Education at the International African American Museum, and we are so excited to share with you our first Let's Talk About It webinar. As many of you may know, the museum opened in June of this year, and myself, along with my colleague Brandon Reed, our public historian, we've been working really hard to launch our program, our educational series through our Learning and Engagement Division. And this is the first of many. And I am thrilled this evening to have with us virtually none other than Professor Cornell William Brooks. And I am going to, of course, take all of the time in the world to read his bio because he is such an important voice for justice and equity in our time today. And I want to, of course, make sure that you all know all about his accomplishments and his contributions to our society. So Professor Cornell William Brooks is Hauser Professor of the Practice of Nonprofit Organizations and Professor of the Practice of Public Leadership and Social Justice at the Harvard Kennedy School. He is also director of the William Monroe Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice at the school's Center for Public Leadership and visiting professor of the practice of prophetic religion and public leadership at Harvard Divinity School. Brooks is the former president and CEO of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He's also a civil rights attorney and an ordained minister. Prior to leading the NAACP, Brooks was president and CEO of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, where he led the passage of pioneering criminal justice reform and housing legislation, 6 bills in less than 5 years. He also served as senior counsel and acting director of the Office of Communications Business Opportunities at the Federal Communications Commission, executive director of the Fair Housing Council of Greater Washington, and a trial attorney at both the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law and the U.S. Department of Justice. As a DOJ trial attorney, he secured a record-setting settlement for housing discrimination victims and filed the first government case alleging housing discrimination against a nursing home. Brooks served as judicial clerk for the Chief Judge Sam J. Ervin III on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. Professor Brooks holds a JD from Yale Law School, where he was the senior editor of the Yale Law Journal and member of the Yale Law and Policy Review. He also holds a Master of Divinity from Boston University's School of Theology, where he was a Martin Luther King Jr. Scholar. Brooks has a Bachelor of Arts degree from Jackson State University, and he is the recipient of several honorary doctorates, including Boston University, Drexel University, St. Peter's University, and Payne Theological Seminary, as well as the highest alumni awards from Boston University and Boston University School of Theology. Last but certainly not least, Brooks is a 4th-generation ordained minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. I know if you all can drop your virtual applause in the chat, please join me in welcoming Professor Cornell William Brooks to talk with us today about race-conscious admissions in higher education. Professor Brooks, it's so good to see you.
It is good to see you. Good to see you. After hearing that long resume, the likes of which only my mother would appreciate, I'm still delighted to be here and be in the midst of so many important folks doing great work at this wonderful, wonderful, wonderful museum. And being from Georgetown, South Carolina, I'm incredibly proud of what you all have created.
Thank you so much. And, you know, we want to talk this evening about that June 29th, 2023 Supreme Court decision, in which the Supreme Court ruled in Students for Fair Admissions Incorporated versus University of North Carolina, and SFFA and President and Fellows of Harvard College. They ruled against the use of race as a decision factor in college admissions for these two academic facilities. And you know, we know that this decision is, of course, tied to many different court cases and movements surrounding affirmative action. So I thought what we may want to start with tonight, and what would be a wonderful exploration for ourselves and our audience this evening, is if you could share with us the history of affirmative action, how its meaning and its application has evolved over time, and then specifically tie it to how this topic applies to this Supreme Court case and the realm of higher ed.
So let's just begin, perhaps oddly enough, with World War II, right? So where we have African-American GIs who literally leave the segregated South and the discriminatory North to go to Europe, to go to Asia, to go to bases here within the United States to make the world safe for democracy, safe from totalitarianism, authoritarianism, Nazism. And so you have these Black GIs going to fight for democracy abroad, though they were denied democracy at home. We have African-American women literally stepping up, stepping forward in the midst of our republic, taking jobs, literally helping America function while the world is at war. And of course, we have millions and upon millions of dollars spent in federal contracts, federal defense contracts. And what we take note of is that while our soldiers are fighting, while our sailors are fighting, while our Marines and airmen are fighting, and also Black women as nurses are serving, we have all these dollars being spent with these defense contractors. But when we return home, and those at home literally return to their former places of employment, or try to, what we take note of is few of those dollars were spent with Black people, an infinitesimally small amount of money. Fast forward to the civil rights movement, when so many people, some of whom your forebears took to the streets to improve this democracy, to make America what it should be in the civil rights movement, in response to both the lack of employment and lack of engagement in federal contracts, the lack of federal employment during the administration of President John F. Kennedy. In the midst of the civil rights movement, an executive order is issued using the phrase affirmative action. Affirmative action meaning proactive. Affirmative action meaning stepping forward, doing something to address a pre-existing harm. So this term of affirmative action, having been birthed during the administration of John F. Kennedy, matures and is also used in executive order during the term of President Johnson, the architect of the Great Society, right? It evolves still, and it is also used during the term of President Richard Nixon. And it comes to mean literally remediating, making whole, repairing the harms, the vestiges of slavery, particularly in terms of contracting and employment. It matures even more when we think about the fact that Black folks, right, regard education, going back to slavery, as a kind of secular sacrament, right? The schoolhouse is a church. The right to read is a sacrament. It is almost holy. And so affirmative action in this context, particularly in the 70s, as African Americans began to attend colleges and universities in mass, affirmative action becomes the means by which we usher Blacks into higher education affirmatively. So in other words, admissions offices look for ways to increase the number of applicants, increase the number of admitted students, And this term of affirmative action evolves over time. So let us think about how affirmative action has come into being in terms of this Supreme Court decision. So affirmative action starts off as a way of repairing a harm, but over time it changes. And so initially, in a case called the Bakke decision, where a applicant to the University of California, Davis Medical School, asserts that they're being discriminated against because Alan Bakke, the plaintiff, says he's being discriminated against because so many seats in this medical school class were reserved for Black people. Those 16 seats were off limits. And so he claimed that this was a quota and as such discriminatory. The court said, well, you can't have quotas, but you can have affirmative action. You can't have set-aside seats, but you can consider race. Then there's another case called the Grutter case or Gratz case, in which at the University of Michigan, a set of students applied to the University of Michigan, particularly the law school, and the admissions committee has a point system, right? And they have a certain set of points which are reserved for students who are part of disadvantaged minorities or Black students. And the court says you can consider race as long as it's narrowly tailored, right? You can't like use it in a broad brush sort of way as a hammer, sledgehammer, as opposed to a scalpel. I have to use it in a narrowly tailored sort of way. Then we have another Supreme Court case called Fisher, right? The Fisher case, Fisher versus Texas, where a student, Abigail Fisher, applies to the University of Texas. And what do we see there? We see an affirmative action case, affirmative action admission policy, which essentially says this: if you graduate at the top 10 in the top 10% of your high school class anywhere in Texas, you're automatically admitted, and that race can also be considered. The court says, even though the litigant or the plaintiff was trying to attack affirmative action, take it out completely, that you can consider race. That is, it is constitutionally permissible. Stay away from quotas, but you can consider race. Now, fast forward to where we are this summer. What happened this summer, right? Mm-hmm. So we have a case where it's called Students for Fair Admissions, right? Let's note this: Students for Fair Admissions. Mm-hmm. This is a group, ostensibly a civil rights group that challenges the admissions policies at the University of North Carolina and Harvard University, where they essentially say their admissions policies, where they consider race among many different things, that this violates the 14th Amendment, that this is discriminatory, and as such, affirmative action categorically, completely, globally should be held unconstitutional. And they're successful. Now, can we just unpack that just a little bit now? So here's this group, Students for Fair Admissions, right? Now they claim to be a civil rights group. Well, I served as president and CEO of the largest civil rights organization in the country. I hadn't heard about them before they began this litigation. If you talk to Mark Morial at the Urban League, I don't think he heard of them either. I don't think they contribute to any of the voting rights causes, the employment causes, any of the kinds of things that many of your viewers would be aware of. But they challenge these admissions policies, essentially arguing that the admissions policy at Harvard and the University of North Carolina prevent, as to say, discriminate against white students and Asian students. Well, here's what we know. Asian students, what Asian students are we talking about? Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, Filipino Americans, Vietnamese Americans, Cambodian Americans. What you find is that a number of students who are of Asian ancestry benefit from affirmative action, as well as Black students. There are white students who benefit from affirmative action. At Harvard, for example, if you are an athlete, let's say, Dr. Knight, you are a champion lacrosse player. You look like a strong, healthy lacrosse player. Well, here's the thing. At Harvard, there's a kind of affirmative action, if you will, for athletes. Or if you or the son or the daughter of alum or faculty, that legacy preference, faculty preference, is a form of affirmative action. So the term has changed over time. It's evolved over time, but it's incredibly important for everybody listening, everyone watching this program.
Yes, I really appreciate that incredible history lesson, because a lot of times, we may hear something today on the news, and of course, you only get an opportunity for sound bites often on the news, and not an opportunity, right, to really unpack and provide the context. And so, in listening to what you shared, and the evolution of both the meaning and the application of affirmative action, to the point where today white students, Asian American students, also some of our students who are a part of our recent international communities that are immigrating to our country, as well as African American students, benefit from affirmative action principles. And so it really sort of begs the question of, what does this particular Supreme Court decision mean for these various groups of students, making sure that we're addressing the ways in which even gender plays into this, as many white women we know have benefited from affirmative action policies as they've been applied to hiring for certain positions within our economy. So I'd love for you to share a little bit about that.
So Dr. Knight, I'm not much of a baker, right? Not much of a cook, but they tell me that if you add baking soda, it helps the bread rise. What we see in terms of the history and the trajectory of African Americans in this country is those government policies which benefit us often help others to rise. So one of the things we take note of is probably the group that's benefited most from affirmative action have been white women, right? Because as affirmative action evolves from race and ethnicity to also gender, white women, being better positioned, although not equally positioned, have benefited greater and faster. So when we look at the boards of many of American companies, we have boards that are very clear about corporate boards that say we want at least 50% of the seats to be women, or a quarter of the seats to be women. You don't hear too many corporate boards saying we want a quarter of the seats to be for African Americans, right?
Right.
Not only have white women benefited from affirmative action, but I would also note veterans. There are local laws, municipal laws, state laws that give a preference, explicit preference, to veterans. They call it affirmative action.
Right.
Not only that, when we look at various ethnic groups, whether it be Native Americans, whether it be Filipino Americans, Cambodian Americans, Vietnamese Americans, there are a good number of ethnic groups that benefit from affirmative action. This is affirmative action based on geography. Now,
really? Okay.
Yeah, so think about this now. So this is really exciting. I just get excited about this, and I hope everybody else gets excited, right?
Hey.
This kind of, you can't go get in your car and put in your GPS affirmative action, but there's a certain geography of affirmative action. Here's what I mean. So if you're from the South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and you apply to many universities in the Northeast, they will preference or pay more attention to applicants who are from places where they don't get that many applicants. Okay? Right,
yes.
Right, so that's a kind of affirmative action. But here's one that I think everybody will find kind of shocking. Now, I'm a guy, I'm a man, you're a woman. And if I were a high schooler, let's say we're both high schoolers, we both apply to college. What many colleges and universities take note of is, for whatever reason, boys' grades in high school go like this. Girls' grades in high school tend to be like this. because boys, not always, but not infrequently, boys mature more slowly. Okay, and that shows up in grades. So when college admissions committees look at their classes, they often admit boys with lower grades and lower standardized test scores, so that they have classes that are 50-50. So white male boys, I should say, white men benefit from a kind of affirmative action. So affirmative action plays out in many different ways. Now, getting back to geography.
Right.
Harvard University, more than 100 years ago, had a president by the name of Charles Eliot, the longest serving president of Harvard. He had this idea that Harvard was insufficiently prestigious, insufficiently academically rigorous. So he said Harvard should be a national university as opposed to a university primarily for men graduating from finishing schools in the Northeast. Mm-hmm. So he said we should reach out to the South, to the West, all across the country. And they practice it almost a kind of a geographic affirmative action in terms of reaching out. It made Harvard the university it is today.
Wow.
Point being here is the more people we bring to the table, the more people we include, the greater the meritocratic rise of the institution. The better, the smarter, the more capable and competent we become as institutions.
Yes. Oh, thank you so much for breaking that down, because you know, we seldom think about the role of geography, but even I think about some of the colleges just by observation here in the city of Charleston, where I'm located. When you take a look at the particular states where most of the students come from, and what comes to mind for me is sort of a comparison between the two city schools here, College of Charleston and the Citadel. And in the case of the College of Charleston, I've been told that there are more students from the Northeast who apply to the College of Charleston than local students. And of course, we know that's a part of an outgrowth of admissions strategies and recruiting students, right? And then by the opposite token, in the case of the Citadel, the vast majority of the students admitted are from either South Carolina specifically or other Southern states. And so again, that is a function of, you know, sort of these recruitment strategies and which geographic regions that the admissions teams reach out to. So as we're sort of thinking about then the impact of this recent decision on our, you know, admissions policies, on our on those individuals who are working in college admissions, you know, what might they need to anticipate to prepare for really a possible shift in making sure that their classes, their incoming classes, are diverse and have an equitable distribution geographically, racially, ethnically, in terms of gender, so on and so forth.
That's right. That's right. So this is, I would say, a historically and morally poignant moment in history, but a perilous moment in education, right? Because it's almost like we have to put our educators beside our attorneys. Why? The Supreme Court decision said that you can't consider race in the admissions process, that this violates the 14th Amendment. Now, I know parenthetically, the 14th Amendment, which made African Americans citizens of the country, even though it was read as being race neutral, if you read the history, some of that history, of course, is in the International African American Museum. Let me note that. If you read the history closely, it is very clear the 14th Amendment was not conceived or implemented as being race neutral. But now let's go back to these admissions committees. So they have to do their work the court, meaning the Students for Fair Admissions attacked Harvard's policy. The court said that you can't consider race in admissions except military service academies, West Point, Annapolis, the Air Force Academy, the Coast Guard Academy. But as of today, the day of this podcast, those West Point and Annapolis have been taken to court as of today, right? Challenging their affirmative action programs. So the admissions committees and our colleges and universities have got to keep an eye on the courts. So what do? They have to think about, how do we have a diverse class without explicitly considering race? You can consider, obviously, geography. You can consider the diversity of educational institutions represented in your class. So, for example, it would be permissible to consider more students from the South, more students from urban schools, more students from schools that are underrepresented, students from schools which are underfunded, perhaps as a consequence of segregation. It would be permissible to consider students from diverse organizations in terms of leadership. Let's say you have many students who have been admitted as a consequence of their participation in boys' state or girls' state, okay? But what about students who have participated in the leadership of the NAACP, the AXO program, the Urban League? What about students who have been active in the work of the International African American Museum, right? My point being is, let's diversify where students are coming from, even if we can't take note of their race or ethnicity.
Right.
I think it's also important to think about what are our qualifications. Here's what I know. When you apply to med school, which tend to be medical schools and law schools tend to be the most competitive schools. When you apply to medical school, here's what I think is important to take note of. Most medical schools are pass-fail. They're not worried about A's, B's, and C's. That you need to pass at a certain high level, and then they evaluate it in terms of residency. So for colleges and universities, do we want to consider a minimum level of academic performance, competitive, right? And above that, take more seriously leadership, take more seriously extracurricular activities, take more seriously community involvement. My point being is, give ourselves more flexibility in terms of building a class. The problem is, if everybody is being admitted who is in the 99th percentile in terms of standardized test scores, well, what is that a measure of? That's a measure of access to standardized test preparation.
Right.
It's not necessarily a measure of academic performance, not a measure of intelligence. It is a measure of your ability to pay for a course from Kaplan or Princeton Review, right? Which has the kind of economic discrimination, a discriminatory component to it. So my point being is, we've got to really look at these qualifications. 1, 2, consider students' backgrounds, their extracurriculars, their leadership skills. And then 3, of course, the institutions, the high schools that they come from, right? And then for graduate schools, I love, I went to Yale Law School, teach at Harvard. I love Yale, love Harvard. But I also went to Jackson State, right? So can we have students from South Carolina State, from Claflin, from Morehouse or Spelman, in our law schools and medical schools to a greater degree, not merely because they're historically Black colleges and universities, but because these are the places where W.E.B. Du Bois came from. These are the places where Elaine Locke, the first Black Rhodes Scholar, taught. My point being here, these are the places where most Black doctors, most Black lawyers, most Black members of Congress hail from. So my point being here is, Race may not be explicitly considered or implicitly considered, but we can certainly consider a diversity of institutions.
I really love these ideas. And, if we have any college admissions staff on the webinar, I surely hope, folks are taking notes, because I think this is an exciting opportunity, especially when we think about taking into consideration the diversity of students' backgrounds. I remember, when I was way back, applying for college and graduate school, it was really important in those admissions letters to talk about my service activities, my involvement in church, my membership in groups such as Jack and Jill of America.
Right.
Those things were really important. And then what did I do in those roles? Also, interest in the arts, training in theater and singing and so forth. And I recall at one point hearing, as one of my siblings was applying to medical school, that artistic background played a big role, right? In sort of helping those medical school admissions committees get a sense of a candidate's capacity to sort of be creative and think outside of the box, so that you could come up with creative solutions to medical problems. So I think that these are tactics that some institutions have already been employing, perhaps not necessarily with a lens toward affirmative action, but they have been successful in creating equitable and diverse classes by considering these many factors.
Now we have to be clear that when we use these proxies, diversity becomes more expensive.
Okay.
Right. So to have a diverse class when you can't consider race, and you have to focus more on the pipeline, focus more on, let's call it the welcome mat to higher education, as opposed to the other side of the door. It's more expensive. The outreach is more expensive. The recruiting is more expensive. Literally paying for, I would call it the diversity creativity, is more expensive. And it's also analytically more expensive, in that you have to devote more time thinking about who's not at the table. If we simply devolve to admit by numbers, you're going to have less diverse classes. What we've seen in the 9 states that have abolished affirmative action before this case, we saw precipitous drops in the number of students at the flagship universities. And what that means is fewer Black doctors, fewer Black lawyers. And this has implications. I want to be very clear about this. Implications not just in terms of who puts MD behind their name or JD behind their name. It has implications for how Black women fare when they go to the doctor or come out of a hospital, how Black children fare. As Ketanji Brown Jackson noted in her dissenting opinion, she said in that case that fewer Black doctors literally means a higher mortality rate for Black women and higher mortality rate for Black children. Why? Because one of the drivers for good health among Black women and Black infants is having a Black doctor, right? Because for whatever reason, Black doctors are more sensitive, more responsive to the needs of their Black patients and even other patients. So the point being here is, this is more expensive, but it's also more life and death consequential.
Wow.
Right? So it's more than, I enjoy teaching at Harvard, but I'm very clear about why I'm there. Right? I'm not there to occupy a seat. I'm there to try to be helpful and of service to our people, particularly those who will never come to Harvard. And the point being here is, diversity is really, really important in terms of folks who will never walk across the college campus. right? This is much bigger than that. This is, these two cases were Harvard, and the UNC. I like to think about it as these cases were about community and people.
That's right. That's right. And as students are considering applying for college, those who are in high school now, these decisions may complicate the educational aspirations of African American students and others. But as we both know, there's always something for us as people and young people as students to do. So I'd love for you to share your thoughts with our students who are on the webinar tonight about what they might be able to do to prepare themselves in this particular environment for college admission, and the role that they can play in preserving access to equitable education for themselves.
Wonderful, wonderful. So let's just begin with a fundamental proposition, a premise. That being this: affirmative action neither created nor can it destroy Black excellence. Right? Let's be very clear about this. Black excellence was pre-existent. It existed way before affirmative action came about with the Great Society, with the executive order under President Kennedy. So just begin there. So if we assume that Black excellence is baked into our history, right? So when we think about the 13th Amendment, freeing 3.94 million enslaved Black people, what did they do from the very beginning? They created a race of people with a 99.9% illiteracy rate, literally created within a matter of years, literary societies in their churches, created newspaper after newspaper, magazine after magazine over the decades. I mean, almost immediately, with very few scholars and educators in the succeeding decades, there was an educational explosion.
Right.
So if that is our background, and we think about today's students being more cosmopolitan, being better educated, having more resources, more analytic capital to work with, we can assume that we can do at least as well as our forebears did. So now what can we do in this moment? Number one, I would say very practically to our high school students, apply.
That's right.
You got to start right there. Apply to schools, even though you think it may be a stretch for you to get in. You have to apply. Number two, double down on doing as well as you can on those standardized tests. That is to say, taking advantage of free prep programs, free standardized SAT, ACT, MCAT, LSAT, free resources and study groups to prepare and start early. And I mean, even if you're in high school and you pick up an SAT prep book in the summers, it's a help. Engage the guidance counselors, engage those who are writing letters of recommendation. Start early in terms of internships, summer jobs, that kind of thing. And here's a little pro tip that I want to pass on the very few students take advantage of. You can write to college or university professors where you want to apply to go to school and ask to be an unpaid research intern. Okay? I have students every year in high school writing to me asking to do research in the summer on an unpaid basis. They do well, and some of them get a letter of recommendation. That's something you can do at your local college or university to, again, get your foot in the door. Obviously, take advantage of any I would say, pipeline program for colleges and universities. You have to sign up for those. Last part of this is, in this environment, streamline your efforts, meaning don't spread yourself too thin. Leave time to focus on the main thing, which is the academics. right? Because what I find is, many of our students have to work,
Right.
have to support families, have to do a number of things that other people don't do. So don't weigh yourself down with too much so that you can't do the main thing. And the last point here is we've not heard the final word on affirmative action. Okay. And so I would encourage students to do all that you can while you can with what you have. And the last word I'll leave you with is simply this. If our forebears, our foremothers, our forefathers, our forebears did all they did with what little they had, why can't we do more with all that we have been given?
Oh, I love that. Yes. Why can't we do more with all that we have and have been given? I really appreciate, these incredible nuggets of wisdom. For those of our attendees who have children or grandchildren who are of college age or will be applying to college soon, please share these insights with them, especially that bit about volunteering with a college professor, or if there's like a center for the study of something that your grandchild or your child is really interested in, looking into maybe offering some volunteer hours in that respect. Certainly here at the International African American Museum, in the next year, as we move closer to our first year anniversary, we will of course be launching programs that will appeal both to our older pre-K through 12 students as well as our college students. So there are also nonprofit agencies and institutions that you can work with as well, and take advantage of opportunities to get to know folks who know other folks who then can write some letters of recommendation for you. So I appreciate this conversation. I feel like we could continue to talk, but I really do want to open up the floor for some questions. And my colleagues, Brandon Reed, our public historian, as well as our public programs manager, Jeffrey Fielding, have been keeping track of questions. And I hope that they will join us on screen now and field a few questions to you from our audience.
Yes, yes. Hello, everyone. And again, thank you, Professor Brooks. Thank you, Dr. Knight, for, again, an amazing conversation. I was over here jotting down notes for myself because I know I have some family members who are going to be first-time sort of college students coming up pretty soon as well. So we're all still trying to figure out how to navigate this unique journey that we're continuing to move forward on. Now, we do have a couple questions in the chat, and before I get into those, I do want to remind all of our guests who are joining us today to go ahead, as we're continuing to answer these questions, to type in any more questions that you may have so we can make sure that we get this answered and we can continue these conversations moving forward. Now, our first question is from Faye, and she is asking about sort of Ed Blum and others winning this battle of affirmative action and so on and so forth. She's asking, what is our next strategy and how can we move forward?
Yeah. So, Faye, that's a great question because Mr. Blum has really launched a kind of multivalent, different levels, and multi-pronged attack on affirmative action. So, if you note, today they filed suit against the military service academies, right? Previously, they filed suit and have taken on a program which supported investment in Black women's businesses. They have gone after the government's 8A program, which was a doorway for so many African-American businesses to get government contracts and as a consequence grow and position themselves for the broader public market. So this is a multi-pronged attack. I think it's incredibly important for us, obviously, to support our legal organizations. I really want to emphasize that. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund and I want to brag a little bit here. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund, if you go to any law school in the country, pull a legal or constitutional case book off the shelf. They're big and they're often read and they're thick. If you take out every case brought by the NAACP, every case inspired by the NAACP, every case in which the NAACP had an interest or literally sacrificed and martyred, that case book would look like a piece of Swiss cheese. That's how important those lawyers are. That's how smart those lawyers are. Support the NAACP and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, because this is a legal fight too, and so we need to be on the forefront. So support those organizations. Number two, I think it's important for us to understand that this is a political fight. Affirmative action was whittled away legally in the courts, but also in terms of public opinion. So it's important for us through our organizations to tell the story about whose affirmative action are we attacking, right? In other words, it's not white people's affirmative action, it's not women's affirmative action, it's only Black people's affirmative action, right? It's important to talk about whose affirmative action. It's also important politically to talk about the diversity of people who benefit from affirmative action, and to literally use our organizations to build the base of support. So when that case went before the Supreme Court, there are what you call friend of the court briefs or amicus briefs or legal papers filed by people who are not parties to the litigation. They're not suing or being sued, but they have an interest in the case. In that affirmative action case, you had corporate America, big companies, the companies you buy from, the companies, the stores you go into, they file briefs saying, we think affirmative action is important. We need not just corporate America to say it, not just the military to say it, but we need to get the rank and file people all across the country to essentially say to the Supreme Court that having police departments that are not diverse is dangerous. Having the medical staff, our hospitals, not having affirmative action, not having a diverse workforce is dangerous, right? And we need to essentially say to our Congress that not having affirmative action, not having diversity in terms of government is dangerous, ineffective, unproductive, and that essentially affirmative action, properly conceived, is an important pillar of democracy. So my point is, fight the legal fight, support those who do that work. Fight the political fight, reach out to organizations that support this kind of work. And again, lastly, it's grounded in our history. When you walk through the International African American Museum, if you look at some of the freedom fighters, the people you see on the wall, Septima Clark, Thurgood Marshall, look, just walk through that museum. It is a testament to Black excellence, but it is also a testament to people who fought to get to the table. And when they got to the table, they made the table bigger. They brought more people to the table. So it's just incredibly, incredibly important that you, come to the table. This is not just a matter of the lawyers. It's a matter for everyone.
Thank you, Professor Brooks. The next question that we have is from Wesley. It says, can you please address what the outcome you think will be for the pending military academy preferential admissions challenge cases facing the Supreme Court? And there's a follow-up that says, what will the potential impact of that decision be?
Well, you have probably asked what I would call the best and the most difficult crystal ball question that could possibly be answered. Here's why. The Chief Justice in the affirmative action case specifically carved out the service academies. I think, or I should say, I would hope that the court and the Chief Justice recognize that the service academies represent the leading edge, if you will, of the military. West Point, Annapolis. These are the places where some of your most elite officers go to school, that they represent essentially the leading edge of national security, and that there is an argument that you need a diverse military. All the generals say this. All the rank and file officers say the idea of having a lily white all male, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, is disastrous for the country. And so I would hope that the court will carve out, have some kind of analytic distinction, some carve out for the military. I think it's going to require some intellectual juggling, some legal juggling, because I didn't agree with the last opinion. I don't think it was particularly well reasoned, but there's no need for them to make bad worse, right? So if they had to juggle some intellectual balls in the air, so be it. But I do think that the service academies are quite different, because the thing is, they're preparing leaders in the broad sense. They're not just training the people who have the highest scores on the LSAT or MCAT or SAT, right? You know, if Putin were to attack the United States tomorrow, and this country had to defend itself, I'm not entirely sure. I love that, you know, I love the LSAT, I love the SAT, I did well enough on those things, but I'm not entirely sure if that's the thing I'd be most concerned about, right? So I would hope that they would rule in a way that protects the ability of the service academies to use affirmative action.
Thank you, sir. I feel like each of these questions, and even more importantly, your answers, are just taking us into so many different topics that I wish we had more time to go into as well.
Yeah.
But we do have a couple more questions coming in from our Q&A section, so we'll prioritize those. This next one is from Samaj. As a law student, I am currently trying to balance my studies with informing others on the implications of the Supreme Court's decision. I'm wondering what words of advice you would have for me as I continue to navigate this space.
You know, that's such a wonderful question. It really speaks to my heart, because many of us go to law school because we are inspired to seek justice for others. But during that period of time, literally our, moot court law review, your next exam, all demanding your time. So what I would say to you is those 3 years you spend in law school are the opportunity you have to sharpen your axe, so that when you leave, you can take more trees down, right? And you can clear the forest of injustice. And so the point being here is that your first priority is literally the academics, literally. And I'm going to give you an example. This is a funny one. Thurgood Marshall is probably the greatest constitutional litigator in American history, certainly of his generation, right? But now, history tells us that Thurgood Marshall was a little bit of a party boy, a little bit of a ladies' man, a little bit of life. He was like the life of the party in college. When he got to law school, he was as serious as a heart attack. Law school is a place where we really need, your intellectual abilities to be sharpened and honed and developed. So put your priority on learning as much as you can, doing as well as you can, and inform others as best you can. But the priority is literally to do as best you can.
Next question. Should we be concerned that these nefarious actors will attack and attempt to dismantle HBCUs next? If so, how will we defend against these actions, and what recourse will we have given the Supreme Court's affirmative action decision?
So, when you have a question that uses the term nefarious actors, right? This is a good question. So I do think HBCUs, when you look at legal scholarship, they are a kind of an interesting entity, right? In that, as you know, I'm a graduate. But when I was at Yale Law School, to get onto the law review, we had a writing competition that was part of the process. I wrote about HBCUs and their vulnerability back then. So I do think that there are certain vulnerabilities, but they're also protected. Meaning you could eliminate affirmative action, or affirmative action has been eliminated, but HBCUs are a matter of tradition. Students choose to go there because of who they serve, how well they have served, and you have a number of HBCUs that have attempted to diversify their student bodies with white students. I think the best way to protect HBCUs is shore them up financially. ensure that they are as excellent as they can possibly be, so that they're able to weather the storms of the vagaries of political support. And lastly, the alumni. Let me put it this way. Harvard might have been sued for its use of affirmative action, but if you tried to sue to get rid of Harvard, that'd be a tough fight, because that alumni is very dedicated. And what I want to say is the alumni in Morehouse, in Spelman, and South Carolina State, and Bennett have to be as strong, because they have just as much to lose. They have just as much to be proud of. But in terms of protecting our HBCUs, it's not just a legal fight, it's really a political fight and a financial fight, and certainly a fight involving alumni support.
Thank you again.
Jeffrey, do we have any more questions? Sorry, I think I interrupted.
No problem. I was actually just about to jump in and say we are actually at the end of our questions. So I was going to ask, before we turn things over to Dr. Knight to sort of close us out, Professor Brooks, are there any more sort of final words or thoughts that you want to leave the audience with?
So first of all, let me just thank the audience for thinking in that robbery to think about our institutions, our legacy of Black excellence and academic excellence and intellectual excellence, and how to grapple with those in the midst of this uncertain legal terrain. I'd simply say this: if you take a look at the same history that you see in the museum, it's a legacy of resilience, right? So in other words, we've had a great many legal cases that have been incredibly discouraging. Right? This is not new, right? But what I'll take note of is our HBCUs grew in the midst of discrimination, in the midst of segregation, in the midst of tremendous legal and political setbacks. The ranks of our doctors and lawyers and teachers and engineers actually grew in very difficult times. So think about it this way. 100 years ago, we had more medical schools then than we have now. We had more Black nursing schools then than we have now. And so the point being here is, let us not confuse legal uncertainty, political hostility, with our ability to aspire, achieve, and succeed. These are related, but they are not in fact the same. And in fact, I like to suggest an inverse relationship, which is to say, the more we are opposed, the more uncertain the times are, the more certain we are, more resolute we are in terms of achieving and aspiring and succeeding. And part of that means investing in our own institution. Support this museum, okay? Support our HBCUs, okay? Invest in our children in terms of scholarships. It's one thing for Harvard to admit the students, it's another thing for us to invest in the students before they get there, okay? I would also say, given that standardized test scores are often the means by which our students are denied access, I like to see every church, every religious institution, every club, or every organization pay for standardized test prep, right? Why can't we have our colleges, our churches paying for our students to prepare for the SAT? Why can't we have our colleges and universities host career fairs, not as career fairs, but internship fairs? Bring these college professors, bring these businesses, bring these corporate executives into our institutions, into our clubs, into Jack and Jill, and have them interview our students to provide internships, and then get people to commit to write strong, well-informed, thoughtful letters of recommendation so that our students are able to get into these schools, okay? And the last point here is, we can't give up on us, right? Because, you know, I'm mindful of the fact that at Harvard, 100 years ago, when Charles Eliot, the longest-serving president of Harvard, came into being, this was a man who had a very interesting racial background. He wasn't a believer in Black people, in the way that we like folks to believe black folks. Nevertheless, during his tenure is when W.E.B. Du Bois got the first PhD from Harvard. It was during his tenure that Elaine Locke became the first Black Rhodes Scholar. It was during his tenure that William Monroe Trotter became the first Black member of Phi Beta Kappa and the first Black graduate of Phi Beta Kappa from Harvard. Why do I say that? We don't need other people to approve of us. We don't need other people to praise us. We don't need other people to vouch for us in order for us to succeed as us. So I simply say this is a difficult moment, but it's not necessarily a moment of defeat or despair.
Wow. Thank you so, so very much. I mean, we have had simply an amazing conversation where we have had an opportunity to unpack the history of affirmative action, to understand its actual roots, to not just let the word slip out of our mouth, but to understand that it means something positive, affirmative action. We have also had, some wonderful insights into how colleges can prepare themselves to approach admissions from a more diverse lens, which and then will increase diversity, but also keeping in mind that it may require the application of greater resources to that process of recruiting. And I'm so glad you mentioned analytics. That's the first thing that came to my mind too, with this process of really sort of investigating, different areas in which we need to collect data on our students at the higher education level. And from there, of course, we had advice for students, answers to these amazing questions from our audience. I am just thrilled to be a part of this conversation this evening. And thank you so much also, Professor Brooks, for so many wonderful shout outs to the International African American Museum. Hopefully our audience can tell that he's been here. In fact, Professor Brooks and I met and had an amazing conversation during our grand opening events. I think we stood in the Gullah Geechee Gallery for like 30 minutes.
That's right. That's right.
Talking, and it was just fantastic. So we just want to thank you again for your time, for your expertise, for who you are, for being a voice for justice, for equity, also for Black excellence. That is so important for all of us to remember, that no matter what we are facing in terms of any type of outside forces or perspectives that may not align with supporting equity for all, we all have our own role to play. And as Maya Angelou once said, still I rise. Still I rise. I rise, I rise. So thank you. Thank you, everyone who joined us this evening. Blessings to all. And we look forward to having another Let's Talk About It. So make sure you stay tuned to our website for future announcements about this series. Thank you all and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Good night.